Every human being has three great fears, and they're not what you think they might be. It's Scott Mason and Tea back in the house. Tea, talk to us about what these three fears are.
Welcome back, everyone. And today I'm so excited about this topic because as we have been talking about the theme of, living in the wild jungle of life versus living in the caged zoo of culture and civilization. That's what the first episode was about. So if you haven't caught that, you may get some context here, but this is going to be an independent episode in itself. So you can just dive into this and go back to that later. Today, we're going to dive into the core fears that keep us away from the jungle and keep us attached to the zoo. The reasons that we prefer the zoo is, in my opinion, deeply connected to our relationship to these three core fundamental existential fears that we have. And as I name these fears, I also want to make it clear that, these, in my way of looking at it, these fears don't really belong in the everyday life. It's not like the fear of rejection, the fear of abandonment and these kinds of things, which are more in a social context. These are very independent, personal, and in a sense, they're very psychological fears. So let's start naming these three fundamental fears that we all have, these existential fears. The first one is the most well-known, I guess, is the fear of death. But you may think that is the fear of death, and that's the ego. But on the other side, in my experience, diving very deep into this topic, what I have discovered is that underneath this fear of death is the fear of eternity and immortality. The second fear is the fear of chaos and not being in control, not having power. And on the other side of it is the fear of power and responsibility. The third fear that we'll be diving into soon is the fear of the unknown. And this, in my opinion, it's one of the deepest fears that we have, because you don't even know what you're afraid of. You're just afraid. It's in a sense, it's like the fear of fear. It's the fear of the unknown. It's almost like the fear of fear itself. It's just feeling afraid of you don't even know what. But on the other side of it is the fear of truth and reality, of what you may discover on the other side. So that's the intro to today's episode, and we're going to be diving deep into each one of these fears. So let's begin.
I'm going to start on that first one, which got quite a reaction from me. Okay, so I grew up in essentially a fundamentalist Christian church, and it was all about, especially under some of the ministers that we had, the fear of death. Specifically, it was predicated on the promise of immortality. Now, there was a lot of discussion, again, under certain ministers, of sin, 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 and hell, 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 and suffering forever. But of course, we as Christians who prayed every day were never going to have to endure that, which to me might explain a fear of eternity. But we were promised all of these cities of gold, and we were going to be in the presence of the Lord forever and sing, 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 and never stop. Presumably our voices would actually be good, because mine sure wasn't any that God would want to hear forever. I don't even think for 3 minutes. But in any event, right, this whole idea of eternal life seemed to me to be a reaction to a fear of death. But I will admit, as I grew older and moved away from those weekly church services, I started to think, I don't know, eternity, is it like all it's cracked up to be? I actually did start to be a little scared of it, because I was like, no matter how great God is, singing songs to him for 3, 5, 10 trillion years, and then knowing that that was just the beginning, and maybe 15 zillion years later, it was all just starting, that did create an existential exploring the universe, feeling joy. I mean, joy for tens, hundreds, trillions and trillions of years, again, that just start. To me, that is terrifying. But is that the sort of existential fear of eternity that you're talking about? Because, I can relate if you're talking about that, but maybe you're not.
It's absolutely that. Is on either side of the extreme, right? Whether it's extreme hell or extreme joy, extreme bliss or extreme suffering. It's forever. It literally means that no matter how much you've lived, you've literally got your whole life ahead of you. Always. It's always the case. And talk about the fear of being enslaved or being in a cage or not having freedom. Like, in that sense, if you do not have a good relationship to this fear of or this idea of immortality and eternity, life itself becomes a prison that you can literally never escape because it's forever. And in my opinion, this is what many of the spiritual traditions especially have attempted to do, is like, can we escape life? Can we transcend the suffering? The suffering of eternity itself also, like the suffering of eternal joy also. So if it's truly eternal, after a point it's like, how much more can I take this?
Right.
And in my way of looking at it, the only real out is a full immersion in the duality of life. And that's what makes Earth so beautiful, is that we've got everything alternating constantly. It's never one thing for too long. And that's what makes it so fresh and rich and alive.
Are you saying that the whole concept of eternity, that at least as we tend to think about it in religious or spiritual terms, is itself some sort of concept that ultimately triggers fear and would, if put out in the world that way, ultimately enslave us, if to nothing else, boredom?
I think once we start engaging with this fear and contemplating it deeply, it really starts explaining the importance of something like creativity and why it needs to be an eternal fountain. Because it's the only freedom, in a sense, is to choose creativity from boredom. Like, even those cycles of boredom and creativity are important, because again, if you're just creating all the time, it's exhausting. But if you get bored and then you get creative, and then you get bored and you get creative, and you're just in this dance, you can actually keep it going forever because you have a break from both. I think the biggest torture, in a sense, is not having a break at all from anything. It becomes monotonous. That is the deepest death, the most profound death and suffering is when there is no break. When it's just the same thing going on forever. In that sense, heaven becomes a hell also.
And the concept of hell, interestingly enough, I've actually, again, as I've mused about the torture that the traditional ideas of heaven could become, hell hasn't always seemed necessarily so bad in comparison, or at least hasn't seemed so much worse, because at least in hell there's action and activity. It's your suffering and it's your torture and it's your twisting and gnashing your teeth, but that's something going on other than singing. But like, in a way, how bad would hell be? After a while, the mind can only contemplate torture and suffering or any experience for so long before it eventually becomes numb to it. So I can't help but thinking, again, after 15 trillion years of burning in lakes of fire, or whatever it is that you believe hell is, and being terrorized by demons or whatever, right? Those demons 30 trillion years later might not be that scary anymore, right? Or you might just become inured to those licks of fire after 9 billion years, but for the entire rest of eternity, you're just sitting there, again, bored, but you're not suffering. And then there is a cruelty that I saw, particularly in hell, that is so disproportionate. Let's say you're the worst person in the world. Let's say you're some dictator that killed not just millions, but billions of people. And let's say you have to suffer 1 billion years for every one of those billions of lives that you killed. Okay. But still, eternity is infinitely longer than that. And you're still, right, still suffering. Listening to you, I can't help but think, again, at least as traditionally envisioned, both these ideas of heaven and hell do sort of thrust down creativity. Even if you're thinking about, well, you're singing the praises of God, or you're in the presence of God, and it is so blissful, it's so powerful, it brings you so much intense joy that you don't need anything else. But it is true, you're not creating. You're either the passive receptacle of God, which is not creative, or if you're singing or otherwise enjoying activities, they're constrained by the activities that this all virtuous God puts in for you. Heaven is a place without suffering. Heaven is a place without toil. Heaven is a place, right? You can't be creative if there's nothing to create against. Necessity is the mother of invention. It's a cliche, but it is going to the fact that people don't just randomly create for no reason. Some people do, but there is always a context that you create from within. Is that when you talk about creativity as a fountain, what you're referring to?
Yeah, I mean, that creativity comes with a lot of resistance, with a lot of challenges, with a lot of obstacles, and that's what makes it fulfilling. If there was no resistance to your creativity, even imagine time disappears as a resistance and everything you wanted just instantly manifested. After a point, you just don't find it fulfilling. What makes it fulfilling in this world to manifest things is that it takes time. You may not in the moment enjoy it because you're impatient for the destination, but if you have the right perception, if you have the right perspective of life, that's what makes it fulfilling, is that it takes time, is that there is a struggle, and then at the end of the struggle you've gotten something, you've gotten a result, you've gotten a reward. That's the thing that makes it fulfilling. But without that struggle, without that effort, without the time, it's just meaningless. It's absolutely meaningless. And I think, when we start understanding this concept, then we start understanding why the world is the way it is, why the descent from heaven created this world exactly the way it is. Because if, let's just say the divine or God just kept replicating heaven and heavenly worlds over and over, it's just the same. Again, everything is easy, everything is effortless, everything is blissful, joyful, peaceful. Where does the change come? For the change to exist, for the change to happen, there needs to be duality. So without duality, there is no fulfillment, there's no joy, there's not real joy. It's just this monotonous joy. But the real joy that we experience as humans comes from not having it for some time, comes from having resistance, suffering, and all of these things. So the idea, which is pretty much behind every single religion, of eliminating suffering, it's so anti-life and it's so anti-God. To understand that God created suffering for us, it's a gift. It's not a punishment, which is what is planted into us in all the religions, especially in Christianity. Since you took up Christianity, you are paying for your sins and the sins of your
Yeah.
ancestors, everyone basically, and Christ is paying for those. But it's everything is a punishment versus suffering is a gift. Truly, when you understand an eternal heaven, then suffering becomes a gift.
You're saying something that is potentially explosive, though, and that a lot of people really, when I talk to them about some of these philosophical concepts, they react very negatively to, which is the idea that those causing suffering are actually doing divine will, or at least furthering the beauty of the experience on earth. And I understand where folks who get their backs up in an arch about that are coming from, because it can be seen to trivialize human suffering. Tio, in 2024, during the American Christmas holiday season, I went to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. To say that experience is overwhelming is a bit of an understatement. And there are a lot of overwhelming individual experiences that one can have during the exploration of the different exhibits in the museum. For me, the most impactful was at the very end. There is video footage of, if I recall right, trucks or some sort of machinery that are just digging out these massive graves where the bodies of people that died in the gas ovens and such were just literally being dumped because no one knew who they were. Their entire families had been wiped out, and there wasn't time or ability to be able to bury all of these people. And so their humanity was just reduced to the same as trash. And that was such an atrocious, horrific thing to see. I can't unsee it. And I raise all of that because that's going as to, well, is this approach that we're talking about really minimizing the true pain and suffering and loss and horror of events like that? How can we hold ourselves philosophically answerable in light of those sorts of things?
The greatest argument of the atheist is that if God exists, why does suffering exist? Why does evil exist? If there was divine power to eliminate suffering, wouldn't God eliminate suffering? Why do children get cancer? Why are children born with cancer or with deformities or handicaps or anything? Like, why wouldn't God just fix that? And yeah, then you have even more extreme things such as the Holocaust and just the innumerable ways to suffer in this world, literally. And it's really not about minimizing the suffering. It's about understanding that it's a gift that gives us purpose. And without that, there is no purpose. So it's not something that we can understand from our egos. It's just as fundamental as that. Our egos are not created, or they're not capable of understanding suffering as being purposeful, because our egos are literally designed to avoid suffering, to protect us from suffering. So we cannot ever contemplate this from the ego or the lower mind, because it will always come up with these arguments. Are you trivializing human suffering? Are you saying that it's a good thing that children are born with cancer? And of course, no one is saying that. No one is saying that. But it's not about it being good. It's about the fundamental mechanics of reality. Like, if that doesn't exist, it's a different type of suffering. So and suffering at its root just becomes all the same. So it's would you want diverse suffering or just monotonous suffering?
Well, but the pushback I would have about that is that, at least in the traditional Western, well, Christianity and Islam too, for that matter. Other words, I'm not going to speak to because I just don't have the knowledge. But at least in those spiritual frameworks, okay, we may not have an answer as to why God brings evil into the world, but God punishes it. There is no pretense that suffering or human abuse or the other is something that God actively wants. Whereas in this framework that we're talking about, it seems as though morality that we define as good or evil really may not even exist. It may itself, if I'm hearing you correctly, purely be a function of ego, which is a very different discussion altogether.
I wouldn't put it that way. It's again, like we have to have this discussion. I think it's very important that we're having this discussion from both levels, from the higher mind and the lower mind, because it's important to address these lower mind resistances and doubts and
Yeah.
skepticism. But at the same time, we have to understand that the real understanding, it's there is a distinction, and you just can one logic doesn't actually compute with the other. So even though suffering is of divine will, not because God wants to torture us, but it's a gift. It's a gift of purpose. Let's just put it this way. At the same time, we cannot abandon morality because that's what keeps the balance of life. We need, even knowing that this is how it functions, this is how reality functions, we must still strive for good. Why? Because that's what keeps the divine order. Because if everything turned to hell and everything was just hell, 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 that in itself is not the purpose. Then again, it becomes all meaningless. It all becomes purposeless. But it's because the duality exists and is kept in literally the perfect balance, divinely, eternally. That's what makes it so beautiful, that it will never become a pure hell and it will never become a pure heaven. Life manifest will always be duality.
If we're saying that morality is something that we always want to aspire towards while we're operating down here on this plane, in order to make sure that the divine balance that the universe has created all of this experience for can be in play, and so that we can avoid this boredom, so we can keep ourselves in a creative space as opposed to a dull space. For that to happen, we have to be able to then, at least while we're on this plane, exercise power. Because what morality is a choice, or at least that's how morality is expressed. Choice taps into power. And to me, that is a connective thread between the fear of eternity and the fear of power.
Let's transition into that. So we have the second fear is the fear of chaos, disorder, not being in control, versus the fear of power, responsibility, and creating order. In my way of looking at things, power is our ability to put order to chaos in our desired direction. That's power. Is when we can create the desired order out of chaos. That's real power. In my way of looking, that's divine power. And in my way of looking at it, real chaos doesn't exist. Real chaos would be that everything is random. And in my opinion, chaos is just a higher dimensional order falling into place.
What do you mean by that?
So basically, when, let's just take the most simple example. When you are cooking something, let's just say you're cooking, you're baking a cake. You're mixing all the ingredients. It looks chaotic. It doesn't look like this is going to become a cake. If that makes sense. So if you just look at it in between, it's just like, what is all of this sticky, gooey, metal stuff? It's yuck. It literally, just look at it, it's like, ugh. But what does it become into? Something ordered, tasty, and delicious, right? Like that's how I see reality, is that we are being cooked, and in the middle of the cooking, it may not feel nice, it may not look nice, but what is the outcome of it all? That for me is the meaning of chaos is a higher dimensional order falling into place. It's just because we see it in the middle of the process that it looks like it's chaos. But if we can see the full picture, if we can see the end result, we'll realize, oh, this was not chaos. And this is something we have, what we call hindsight. When we look at so many of the things that caused us suffering and struggle and our challenges, and even the mistakes and the failures and the obstacles, we realize that they were the reasons that we got the outcome. That if we had followed the exact plan, maybe we would not get the greater thing that ended up becoming manifest because of the experience that comes from failures and mistakes and all of that. It's like that is the divine recipe, is that it's all baked into the process. But we cannot judge it as chaos in the middle of the process, because that is short-sighted. That is looking at it from the lower mind. It's like, oh, I don't like it right now. That means it's wrong. It's bad.
Why do you think people, unless they're trained in it or maybe have some sort of natural disposition, are not able to have this sort of foresight? I'm thinking back to our first episode, for instance, when we talked about Prometheus versus Epimetheus. Prometheus being foresight, who created humanity and gave us the gift of tools and technology and fire to be able to empower humans to have the ability to make these choices and to be able to exercise creativity, whereas Epimetheus was just caught in the moment, overwhelmed by whatever goodies were in front of him as he was making animals, and just threw things at them left and right without thinking about the implications of the most favored creations of all, humans. Is there something fundamentally human or fundamentally essential about at least starting out in life without that ability to have foresight?
In my way of looking at it, it's all part of the divine design. That if we had foresight right from the beginning, we would just do everything perfectly, then there would be no chaos and there would be no problems. But we also meant to create our own problems. We're meant to add to the chaos. Like the way that we are contributing to the chaos is purposeful. It is intentional. It is what makes life interesting. If we just behaved perfectly, the game just becomes boring once again. In that sense, there needs to be some randomness of humans get to have free will, because we are co-creating the game with the divine. And the divine just has the power and the ability to keep incorporating all our actions and our decisions to keep evolving the game eternally.
You know, as we're going back and forth about this, I can't help but think about one of my favorite writers, J.R.R. Tolkien. In J.R.R. Tolkien's works, there are divine angelic beings that inhabit the earth, and they have the ability to embody themselves in physical forms. And in their physical forms, they can follow the optimal divine plan, or they can let the ego that accompanies the physical form take over their mission. And when that happens, they become these evil, tyrannical wizards or other demonic beings that essentially are the core villains of the Lord of the Rings and the other works of Tolkien. I raise all of that because at the end of the Lord of the Rings, the two great villains, these angelic beings who have tried to be tyrants and rule the world, basically, are physically destroyed and their spirits are dissipated. They remain alive and conscious in our world, but without the ability to do anything in it. They're essentially, for all of the history of this planet going forward, condemned to living out a life of boredom. And it's almost like I'm hearing you say that perhaps the existential fear that we all need to have is exactly that. Boredom.
Because again, we are talking about eternity. If you're bored for eternity and there is no escape, that is in some ways the worst hit. As conscious beings, right? Like when you talk about Prometheus' gift of fire or tools or technology, for me, it's intelligence, it's awareness, it's consciousness. That's the gift that we got as humans that separates us from animals. And having that awareness that it's our responsibility to keep the game engaging and interesting. We cannot expect it to just automatically do that for us. When we gain consciousness, it's us who have to make order out of chaos, who have to give meaning to life, who have to give purpose to our actions. And that happens when we are in alignment with the divine order. But true alignment with the divine order means that you also play the roles that do not or may not morally look good. They may morally look wrong, but that is exactly what you're meant to be doing. Sometimes you're meant to hurt your partner, and pre-awakening, you may do it unconsciously. The only difference post-awakening is you would realize that this is the pain that they need to experience. And so I will play my role in it. And that, in my opinion, is what creates the much deeper fear of power and responsibilities, that now you know how you're causing pain and that it is meant to be caused. And that's just the way life is. When you're unconscious, you can be afraid of chaos and disorder and not being in control and being a victim, but at least you're not responsible for it. You can blame God, you can blame nature, you can blame the dictator, you can blame whoever you want. Because it's not my responsibility. Why does life suck? Why is life so bad? Why is the world so evil? When you're in the fear of chaos, you can have that narrative. But the moment you have consciousness, which takes us into our, also slowly transitions into the third one, which is the fear of the unknown and the fear of truth and reality. Just when you become acquainted with the truth and the reality, you can just see what is happening. That's the only difference. It's not that all of a sudden the truth makes life good and positive. It's just, okay, I did not understand why the world was this way, and now I understand it. And in that, there's a lot of reduction in suffering. Because I don't need to suffer because of the way reality is. If I'm an acceptance that, okay, reality entails suffering, life entails suffering, it's just part of life. Okay, then I can also choose to enjoy life, and I can finally come into the perspective that life truly is a divine gift. Because if you take away suffering, that means there is no life, that means there is no existence. And what would be the only thing worse than having a life in which suffering is a part of life? It's not all of life, but the only thing worse than having life with part suffering is no life at all, no existence, nothing, absolutely nothing. So in my eyes, I would much rather have life if it means that there is suffering in half of it, versus not having anything at all. I would definitely choose life every single time for eternity.
Some people might disagree with that, though, due to perhaps some of the reasons that we've talked about earlier, but due to something else that I've been thinking about even as you were going through that last set of points. One of the beautiful things, too, about being a victim and not having to bear the responsibility of true agency, of having true power, is that in addition to everything always being outside of your control, you don't ever have to experience guilt. And you also don't have to experience a certain amount of shame. Yet, also, one of the things that you and I have in common as coaches and people who work with those who are seeking to find a path that is right for them in life is wanting to drive them towards a sense of alignment. And I agree with you strongly what you said about moral values, that who you are and what your values are not necessarily what the world says that it should be. And some people, they either just don't have a value system or their values are perhaps antisocial. That I urge my own clients, they need to own and be honest about. But if you truly take agency over who and what you are, and you truly are able to look at the consequences of your action because you've stepped into that level of your thinking, uh, shame and a sense of guilt may be something that themselves you have to bear. Do you think that moving into a higher and higher place of consciousness might be assisted by being able to let go of emotions like shame and guilt?
See, it really depends on, again, what level of consciousness you're looking at this from. If you're looking at this from lower consciousness, there's one narrative which we are all pretty familiar with. But when you look at it from higher consciousness, shame and guilt would arise if you did not do what you were meant to do. And that could also include doing something which is generally considered morally wrong. But if you do it, you in your soul feel like, yes, I did exactly what I was meant to do. I don't feel guilty about that. Whereas in lower consciousness, you may do the thing and you may blame yourself for doing the thing. And I'll give the perfect example for this. It's parenting. It's the best example. As parents, unconscious, like most parents in the world, I would say, live in lower consciousness. So they do not have a lot of awareness of what they're doing. They may be trying their best or whatever, but generally speaking, they don't know their drives and their intentions and their motivations beyond a certain point. And they may hurt their children, sometimes very horribly. Now, if that had to be done consciously, to realize that sometimes I need to hurt my child because it's good for their own growth, would that make you guilty, or would that make you realize that this is what actually good parenting looks like? But in the lower consciousness, you will do the thing anyways. You may end up hitting your child, you may end up punishing them, you may end up whatever, scolding them, denying them something like a gift or their favorite toy or whatever, or their playtime, whatever, all of them, all of this, you may be doing it for their own benefit, but you may still feel guilty about it because, well, it's my child and I don't want to see them hurt. Instead of realizing actually to see them hurt is not a bad thing. It's really not a bad thing. It can be so helpful for children to be hurt once in a while. And again, like this, for some people it'd be like, it sounds a bit crazy. It may sound like being a sociopath or a psychopath, but it's not really, because you're deeply connected to your emotions and your feelings. And it's not that it doesn't hurt, but you understand the purpose of the hurt. You don't feel guilty about it. So my favorite way of looking at it is that in higher consciousness, suffering disappears, but pain doesn't. And understanding the distinction between these two, I think it's very powerful, because pain is just a part of life, but you don't have to suffer because of that. And a lot of people experience both pain and suffering, and they suffer because they're suffering, and it just becomes this downward spiral into extreme suffering. But if we can just feel the pain and realize that, yeah, it is painful to hurt my child, but I see the purpose of it, and I'm actually glad that they're going to grow from this experience. I get to say no to them because they're playing too much video games, and I know that it's good to say no to them. They may be hurt, they may be angry at me, they may hate me, and I may not like that, but I know it's the right thing to do.
I'm going to even take that example a step further because I think it's so important and it's had such a transformative impact on my own life. I suffered a lot, or I endured a lot of pain, I should say, at the hands of my own parents. I was physically abused. I received severe beatings when I was a child, and to this day I have no idea what they were for. I honestly have no idea. And so I was constantly in this state of terror as a child, and it impacted my way of being as an adult and cemented within me, or at least I chose to cement within myself a victim mentality as a response to that. It was actually a huge gift. I don't know that many people would overtly say that child abuse was a wonderful thing to have had happen to them. And 10 years ago, I would have been outraged at the thought. But it has enabled me to go on an incredible journey. Existing at the extremes of life can teach you so much. And child abuse is a place that exists at the extreme of life. And my journey has been so far because of that, as opposed to if I just had a perfectly mellow, uneventful childhood where there may have been no journey that I needed to take at all, or maybe just a little bit of a journey, right? The longer the journey is, the more peaks and the valleys there are, the further you have to come, the more accomplished, the more gratified you feel as you've experienced that. I'll also say that as I've moved beyond the earlier negative judgments that I had of my parents because of the way they've treated me, and chosen to let that go, the suffering that you talked about really was something that after a while was solely being brought on me by me, and this holding on to anger and resentment about it was really not fairly acknowledging the benefit of what it was ultimately in my life. I've also come to realize that shame, in particular, of the two emotions that I mentioned earlier, is something that I was choosing to experience because of the abuse. And understanding that emotions like shame, guilt too, but shame, because it's one of these externally imposed things that you can adopt as your own. Letting go of that, so long as I'm being true to myself, has actually tapped into this unbelievable sense of power. Sometime after we recorded our last episode, I woke up one day realizing shame is something I don't have to have, and I released it. And I felt my consciousness expand tenfold. And I've gone along my own spiritual development journey and my connective journey with the divine further than many people have. But one of the beauties of it is that these things continually emerge and pop out, and these growth areas don't stop. Talk to me a little bit about what those statements that I just shared trigger in you, and how do you respond to people who might be listening to what I said and be a little bit incredulous, or even saying to themselves what you just said? Scott, you just defined yourself as a psychopath.
I resonate a lot with your journey because there are similarities on my journey, and there's three things I would like to say. First is what you shared just now, is that you used your power to redefine the trauma as a gift. And that is exactly what power is. It was a chaotic experience that you shaped into something that is beneficial to you. And just understanding that is a power that we all have. And it cannot actually happen until we do that for ourselves. Until you redefine that trauma into something that is beneficial, either as a gift or a power or all of it, it will remain something that tortures you, something that makes you feel like a victim, something that makes you feel ashamed, guilty, powerless, and all of that. All of the effects of the trauma will live as long as you see it as a punishment or as something that was done unfairly to you, rather than a gift that was given to you by someone who was playing a very difficult role. It's very difficult to see that until we have truly matured into our own adulthood and we use our power, and sometimes it causes pain to other people, but you realize that that pain is your gift. And that maturity takes time. And I remember the moment in my own life when I was so grateful to my parents for every single thing that had happened in my childhood, my whole life. And I'll tell you the big shift where it awakened was self-love. When I realized I love myself the way I am today, I love myself so much the way I am today, and I could not be exactly who I am today if I had literally not been shaped by beatings, whether they were from family or they were from friends or teachers or whoever. Like, it's literally like, you are unshaped clay being beaten into the shape that you are. And if you can love that shape, then you realize, well, that's how this beautiful thing needed to be shaped. Sometimes it takes some pressure and some beating from the outside. And it really was such a fundamental shift that it's because I love myself that I can see that everything has been a gift. But we can also see the opposite side of it is that if you keep blaming your parent because you don't like the way your life is, or you blame society, you blame culture, teachers, whoever, it's just because you don't love yourself the way you are. And you think that you will love yourself if you were perfect because your life was perfect. That's not real love. That's just not how love works, because then you'll become perfect, which people do with, plastic surgeries, and they get all the money in the world and they make their lives perfect, but they still don't love themselves. Loving yourself has nothing to do with what you have and how life is going. Like, just understanding that was so life-changing for me. And then the moment you love yourself, then life is great. Everything has been perfect up until this point, and it will continue to be perfect because whatever life brings to me now is my gift, it's my resource, and I get to use it, shape my life, because I have power to use everything that life is giving me, including my challenges, my obstacles. Everything is just a gift from life. Every single thing is a gift from life. It's so life-changing to look at life that way. The biggest gift is life itself. Like, what a gift. We will never understand how it came into existence out of nothing. Like, we have life. The opposite of it is nothing. Like, just imagine that it would be nothing. No one would experience anything. Like, that is so miserable to even imagine. Just that, wow, life is so profound. It's such a beautiful gift. However it is. If you love life, it's a gift. If you don't love your life, it's a prison. It's a hell. You don't need to go to hell. You are living hell if you don't love life. And I'm not even saying loving your life, just loving life itself. Like, the idea, the concept, the energy, everything is just like, what the hell is this? It's life. So those were two things that I wanted to say.
I did want to go on an important little deeper dive into the first of those things, which is self-love. One of the things that I have found as I have stepped into true self-love, again, it's created this sense of openness and this sense of lightheartedness, this sense of connection with a larger flow, and this sense of joy, which we haven't talked about a lot so far. I'm sure we will. But joy that's not just clapping our hands and, raising pom-poms up in the air, but this almost existential joy, which I feel in life because of self-love. And I raise that as such a positive thing because there is, in a lot of the personal development space, for reasons that we talked about in one of our earlier conversations, right? Self-development as opposed to spirituality, as opposed to connection with the divine. When we talk about and think about or hear in media or about self-love, it tends to be in that personal development space, not with relation to any connection with the divine or even spirituality. And it's tainted the concept of self-love. There's a lot of reactive self-love. I've been through all this and I love myself. But it's not said with a sense of existential joy. It's almost like I'm saying I love myself so I can really believe it, or I love myself despite the odds, or despite what other people think, or despite whatever has happened to me as a victim in life, as opposed to I love myself as someone who had agency and experienced this garden of life, including some of the rotten, stinking areas in the garden where there might have been some shit laid down by some animals, as well as the cool areas with the tree of life and the petting zoo of all these exotic creatures that want to hang around you. Have you experienced anything like that? And how can we guide people to understand that when they're feeling self-love, or when we're talking about self-love, we're not talking about this lower level version. We're talking about something far more profound, at least to me. At least I am.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen it so much on platforms like Instagram. Like, self-love is going and giving yourself a massage, or like going for a massage, or going for physical training, and all of that are there are actions that you can do because you love yourself and you want to take care of yourself, and you want to make, like, you just want to treat yourself well. But the difference is that it's inspired from self-love rather than it being self-love.
Right.
And I think there's such a fundamental difference in that, is that one is action and one is being. And action can never replace being. You either love life and yourself because you are life. Like, there's no separation in that sense. If you do not love life, you don't really love yourself. If you don't love yourself, you don't love life. Like, it's completely the same in my eyes. Like, that is the deepest self-love. Let's just put it this way. Like, only when you really love yourself, you really love life, and the other way around.
Wow. Wow. When you think about it, right, life is the totality of the life that we've had, including the things that might not superficially seem lovable.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And if you don't love the world, you don't really love yourself and life. Like, it's just to understand it. Like, that for me is, this what they call the Buddha enlightenment, is that you're just one with everything. But that doesn't mean that you stop the suffering. So in my eyes, that was the Buddha's biggest mistake, was to think that suffering is meant to be eliminated from life. Because in my eyes, being anti-suffering is being anti-life. You want to kill suffering, you want to kill life. You want to end life, essentially. And as long as we can just love life for what it is, not want to remove the fundamental aspect of life itself, then that is true love for me. And I feel like the Buddha got this, but then it's very difficult to tell people, okay, just embrace the suffering and it's fine. So then you have to create a religion, or you have to create teachings where you tell people, like, yes, we should transcend suffering. But there is one of the lesser known things that the Buddha said, is that I know that it's impossible to eliminate suffering, yet I vow to eliminate suffering. So in that, he's revealing the truth that it's never going to end, but I have to be the moral person who is working towards that, because that's what keeps the universe's balance in place. He's not saying like, suffering is actually meant to be eliminated. It's just that we must struggle to end suffering, knowing that it will literally never end. If anything, the more light, the more order, the more joy and beauty and everything that's on one side of duality, the more that exists, the more suffering and chaos and darkness exists. It's literally proportional. So it's very twisted to think of it this way, but the more good that you do, the more suffering you create in the universe. That's the law. It's literally the law of the universe.
Then also by bringing that additional suffering in, we're each helping to create circumstances in which people are able to escalate the resulting beauty and wonders of the universe from that. So even by creating that suffering, we are serving a constructive purpose and serving a purpose that is going back to the theme of what keeps eternity from being boring and something of existentially terrifying. Creativity, right? We're again escalating the level of creativity needed for the universe to even function, which is an awesome thing.
This is exactly why, when we started, we did the first episode, we spoke about power and genius. And for me, genius is when we can tap into that divine creativity, which is true creativity. Because there's a lot of creativity which is repetitive and just keeps things going on the same path. And there's nothing wrong with that. But what keeps the universe in expansion is what you were just talking about. When there is this, when we're creating more good, we're creating more suffering. But that is literally what expands the universe. That's what keeps life going eternally and expanding eternally. But expansion happens through truly new creativity. Is that you suddenly come up with this genius idea to do something in a completely different way. And sometimes those are very twisted, and they're sometimes it's psychopaths that are coming up with really genius ideas. But yeah, that's just creativity. Is how can I do this in a completely new and different and unique way? Let's just take cyber crimes. If all cyber crimes were just of the same style, it would just be instantly caught always. But it's because these hackers have this insane creativity, like literally it's insane and it's creative at the same time, that they're always inventing new ways to break into systems. And so just that's what keeps the police force and the good guys and the cops in play, right? If literally if it was just one type of crime always, we could automate it and there would be no jobs left for the good guys. It literally is what creates purpose for the good guys, is that evil exists. Without evil, there is no good. There are no good people. There is no morality. Is the end of life.
Couple of side comments about that. First of all, that has me thinking that a lot of the fears that people have about AI, particularly if they all come true, which they may well, replacing a lot of human functions, again, can actually be a really, really good thing. Even though for specific individuals it may be uncomfortable, it is a classic disruptive human creation that forces us through some very, very difficult times that it may create to become more authentically creative, and authentically creative for the foreseeable future, because AI itself can do repetitive, simple kind of BS creativity. It forces us evolutionarily to escalate what we are in the game for. Also, earlier this year, I was in a very, very deep sleep. And then as I was in that liminal space between sleep and being awake, what I call the space of the oracle, where these prophetic or these divine downloads can really come through to you, I heard this male Zeus-like voice say, 2.5 years, and then there were thunderbolts, and I woke up with a start, and that was all. That was it. A couple of months later, I know, how's that for dramatic and weird? I love it. A couple of months later, a friend of mine gifted me with a visit to a psychic intuitive that she sees, and as I believe we've discussed before, anytime someone says, I will give you the gift of a psychic, I am never going to say no. It's impossible. I do not have agency over that part of my life. I'm the victim. Just kidding. But in any event, I chose to see her. And she said, ask me a question. I said, what did that mean? And her answer actually made a lot of sense. Scott, 2.5 years, she said, is your soul cycle. It can be very easy for you to get in repetitive or very easy, sort of going with the flow, creative and growth patterns. I'm telling you that that was the universe saying to you, Scott, if every 2.5 years, and she gave me a start date for it, if you're not radically shifting and radically upping your game, the universe is going to make sure that you are forced to, and you're not going to like it. Now, who knows whether her prediction was true? But what that got me to think, and what I have embraced again as the beauty of life, and I even put it in my calendar every 2.5 years, I need to train myself to be that person who, in one way or another, whether it's through partners that I work with or putting myself in bizarre situations, to be able to trigger that explosive sort of creativity. Sometimes it's going to come seemingly on its own, but other times I firmly believe, again, on this theme of having agency and power in our life, we also have the power to put ourselves in situations in which we know we will be forced to escalate, elevate, bring out our creativity, even if it is uncomfortable. And then also embedded in what she said was exactly what you were saying. The universe is going to force you to be that way. You're not going to like it. But that's not such a bad thing. If I hadn't had the gift of maybe her words, it might not have occurred to me to be thinking through some of these bad things that may happen every 2.5 years in the spirit of Prometheus.
Again, in my experience, if once you start choosing to disrupt your own life, whenever it's meant to be disrupted, that for me would be living in alignment with divine guidance. Is that I usually start getting my signals pretty early on, and I follow them, and that's why I have not really suffered in my my last decade. I would say is that, or maybe at least especially in the last 6 to 7 years, my whole thing has been, however uncomfortable it is, I will listen, because I know life will otherwise make it very uncomfortable, and I just prefer to make my own life uncomfortable than have it be forced upon me. It just gives me a sense of agency and freedom and power, versus I'm a victim to life and life is becoming hell, and why is it happening this way? It's just like, I just know this is how life works, so let me just do it my own way and enjoy it. Enjoy the process of disrupting my own life versus suffering through it. The pandemic is a great example of it. 3 months before the pandemic started, actually, probably when, the early traces of COVID started in China, I started getting signals from many directions that it's time for me to make a big change in my life. And so basically it was, I think, January of 2020 was the first time I did not facilitate a retreat at the retreat center I was working. Since 2015 was the first time I said, I think I want to take a break for a retreat. And then I did the one in February, and then basically in February I just said, okay, I'm done. I'm done facilitating retreats at the retreat center. And I basically spoke to the owner at the time, and I said, and the good thing was that she had a replacement for me. So it was a very smooth transition, and it was perfect. I said, okay, I'm done. And March was the last one that I facilitated. And I said, okay, that's it. I have to do something new with my life. And guess what? April, the retreat shuts down. April was the last retreat. So that replacement did one retreat. And then the retreat center had to shut down for COVID. But again, if it was not planned by me, if I had not listened to the guidance and stepped away, I would have felt like, shit, now what do I do with my life? Things were so good. Everything was so comfortable. Now I have to do something else. Maybe the retreats will never start again because the world will never start again because of COVID. Like, that's the way people were thinking, when COVID happened. But I was already prepared for it. And I already knew, okay, it's time to go online and it's time to start my online business. I had already started putting the seeds for that even before the world shut down. So everything was just so precisely guided. It's so precisely guided. All I had to do was listen.
During our last discussion, we both shared how we, prior to our journeys down this path, were atheists, defiantly so, and self-satisfiedly so. And my first experience was in January of 2019 when I took a mini MBA program. I owned another business at the time with a business partner, and during the first class of this mini MBA program, I suddenly just felt inside like a string had pulled at my heart and was pulling me in a different direction than my business partner and the business itself, as well as I was feeling a push from behind. It was some sort of force that was pointing me in a different direction. And so conflicts I had with my business partner escalated over the course of the year. We ultimately decided to separate, and literally we signed our separation papers the first week of the lockdown. Literally. And while that was happening, normally, due to the way I had chosen to interpret life events in response to the abuse I mentioned earlier that my parents gave me as a child, I would view potential calamities in the most catastrophic, reactive, oh my God, let me pull out my gun and begin to shoot sort of way. And curiously, this time I felt bizarrely calm. Now, I took the appropriate protective measures that were required by law here in New York City, but people were running around saying, I'm going to die, oh my God, and people were dying, so those concerns weren't ridiculous. But I remember thinking, I'm actually going to be totally fine. And I also started having, when I would meditate, these visions of myself as a wind-up toy in the corner that had finally been completely wound up and was starting to march. Right? The signals were there. Now, I wasn't fully developed. I think that was the trigger for me to begin going on the journey that I was on. But it was one of these things where the ability to listen, or the willingness to listen, actually did save me, at least, from this sort of cataclysmic sense of doom that the pandemic was bringing into a lot of discourse everywhere. Tio, one of the resistances I had to viewing ethics, morality, suffering, quote unquote, evil in the world in the framework that we're talking about was that I would begin to see human behavior in this more cosmic, big scale way than I had grown up seeing it as, had acclimated myself to seeing it as, and was comfortable with. One of the biggest things that I had to break through, and that knowing each other and working together has brought to me, has been accepting the fact that the truth about the nature of the universe and humanity and myself as a living being was quite different than I thought it would be. And that has been something that has been, over time, very difficult to grapple with. Perhaps we might want to chit-chat a little bit about that third great fear.
It's the perfect time, because we think that we fear the unknown. We think that we fear what we don't know what's going to happen. But the truth and reality is so much scarier. It's so much scarier. Because when you can understand these fundamental laws of reality, that suffering is a part of life, it's literally never going to end. It's forever. It's just there. When you understand that you are going to be responsible for causing pain to other people, there is no such thing as an absolutely good person. It just doesn't exist. Even an absolutely good person is causing pain to all the people who cannot be absolutely good, because they feel envied, because they feel because that person is such a perfect model, I just feel less than. That is how you're causing suffering. It's just impossible to be a person who doesn't make other people feel some kind of pain. You may not be doing it intentionally, You may not even be responsible for how is it my responsibility if others are jealous of me? It's not, but it is a consequence of you being you. It's just what it is. So when we understand that we have to live with that, we have to live with the world being the way it is, and it's never going to be fixed. Like Earth is never going to be fixed. It's just never, ever, 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 ever going to be fixed. When you understand these fundamental truths and you can live in acceptance of that, the unknown is so much less scarier because you know that whatever is unknown is happening within the context of these laws, these fundamental universal laws. And if you have the power to deal with these laws, right? If you can dance with these laws, if you can navigate life with these laws for 10 years, you can do it for 20 years and 30 years and 50 years and 100 years and a million years and a billion years. Like, all you're doing is constantly dancing with these laws. What's the worst that can happen? You will suffer. You will feel some pain. If that is the worst that can happen, you already accepted that. So that's what makes the unknown so much less scary then, because I know what is the worst that can happen. I will experience physical death. I will experience a painful death. Okay. So what? Like, I've experienced death a million times and I'll experience it a million times more. After some time, at a soul level, there is no fear of it. Because you understand it's just a transition. My soul will enter this body and it will leave this body. And it will enter another body and leave that body. And yet again and again for eternity. And while I'm there, it's a bit exciting to feel that fear of death. It's a bit exciting to feel this adrenaline, this rush to survive, to play these games of survival. To dance with life in that way is also exciting. So if we just understand this, the fear of the unknown changes completely, and then it's like, yeah, there are things about reality that are way scarier to accept and embrace, and I can now start working on that.
And reality can be scary to embrace, and truth, if for no other reason than because so much of how we find comfort in dealing with this supposed fear of the unknown in our lower levels of consciousness is framed by what's the worst that's possible. Knowing and understanding that reality is so much more comprehensive and expansive than we could imagine, right, means that there is actually no bottom or top to the abyss as to what is possible to occur, which means there's really no way to even begin to calculate or assess risk. I'm reading a great book now called Anti-Fragile. And what the author is positing in this book is that by attempting to eliminate volatility, the systems that we have in modern society actually end up creating worse volatility because we're eliminating all of the data that we might get from smaller volatilities that could prepare for us for that. And then, of course, it makes us more fragile in response to these black swan events when they actually occur. In a way, what you're talking about, embracing the acceptance of true reality, is, on the one hand, letting us be more anti-fragile than we could possibly be otherwise, but it is also saying that even death itself and the pain accompanying death may not be the most dramatic or the most consequential of things that we may face during our existence, particularly if we're talking about consciousnesses that may split up and coming down to into a whole multiplicity of lives. And if you accept some of this thinking too, it could be multiple lives in a whole host of other environments and a universe that is almost incomprehensibly vast.
It's really tough to digest all of this. It's just, that's another reality. And to some extent, we can never digest all of it. And that's what is also part of the design. Like, if you understand that the worst thing that you can experience is suffering, right? That's the worst thing that can happen to you, is that you will suffer. You just don't know in what way you will suffer. That's what makes it scary. And there's some beauty in that. There's some aliveness in that. If you could just predict all the ways you could suffer, you could control it all. Again, it's the death of life, right? If you really don't know what's going to happen, are you even going to suffer or not? Because so many people live in this prediction of suffering that they don't end up living. That is what puts people into the zoo, is that, oh, I'm going to suffer, so I'm just going to avoid life. I'm just going to remain in this very uncomfortable bubble, but at least it's known. At least my zoo cage is the suffering that I know. So I'm okay here. I'm good here. That's what keeps people in the zoo. The wild, the jungle is, I don't know what's going to cause me suffering. I don't know the ways I'm going to fail, the ways I'm going to be rejected, the ways I'm going to be abandoned, the ways I'm going to be betrayed, the ways I'm going to be hurt by life and by other people. I actually don't know from where the snake will come from, where the scorpion will come from, where the tiger will come. Can literally come from any direction. And that's what is so alive about living in the jungle, is that I don't know how I will suffer. I know I will suffer. I don't know when. I don't know how. I don't know how much. But I also know I will enjoy life. And if I do not take the risk of the suffering, I also do not have the joy of life, because then I'm just living in the zoo constantly.
And it is odd when you frame it that way, that there is a tendency that so many folks, including through much of my own life, right, that's been me, to discount joy, to discount extremes of joy for the sake of avoiding suffering that I might predict or that I might not be able to imagine. I'm also willing to just outright not think about, cannot imagine, or will not imagine extremes of wondrous taking in of life, of really, I hate to use a word like this because it can sound a little bit cliche, but it is true, feeling true ecstasy. And yet, as we were talking about last time, and as I have embraced this way of thinking, sometimes there is ecstasy in small moments, but there's also the ecstasy of contemplating and moving towards big moments that only can conceivably be reached for if you're willing to accept the possibility of extreme suffering that may either come as a consequence of those or along the way.
And many people, like, I think we live in a very risk-averse culture, and most people just don't want to take the risk that I will have a lot of joy, but the cost of that could be a lot of pain and suffering. And I think that's where my hat really goes off to the risk takers. And I do pride myself in that. And, it's a challenge to remain a risk taker, because again, like, once you have taken a bunch of risks, you're like, okay, have I taken enough risks? Now can I just enjoy life and just go back to the zoo? And it's like that, like, to actually understand that you have to be an eternal risk taker. That's what living is. That's what living in a jungle is, that you're an eternal risk taker, because otherwise, the moment you stop taking risks, you've just settled for a cage in the zoo. And so many people, like, when they reach a certain level of success, they just settle for the zoo. Well, now I've got a really fancy cage in the zoo. Why the hell do I need to take risks? And that's where death begins. That's where people just begin to wither away.
One of the most constant things that people seek is connection with other human beings. One of the beauties of the zoo is that you have all the other animals in other cages that are in their cages with you. You have the zookeepers that you're familiar with, and you might even be vaguely aware of the zoo managers. And even if you don't know them personally, you're more or less aware of the way they run the zoo, so you feel them. When you're out in the wild, human connection is much more tenuous. When you and I first started our work, one of the things that came up quite early in our discussions was the fact that human connection might look very different as my own life stepped forward than what it did in the past. And to me, that was a very scary unknown. I saw on Instagram recently a short little video by an influencer. He like is kind of a fashion and style influencer. And I normally don't take a doggone thing that he says seriously because of that, but he did say something this time that resonated. He said, when you become an influencer and you really have reach, all of the people that you knew beforehand, they'll abandon you. They will be the last people to support you. And I have actually really found that to be true. Leaving behind the comfort of the relationships that you had and that connection, and understanding that there's going to be a lot of, in terms of quote unquote suffering, that lack of connection as you shift is something that is of profound existential, if not explicitly stated, fear. I mean, I've had prospective clients or even existing clients say, I don't know about the work we're doing together because it's going to change the relationships that I have. You know, my response is, yeah, it will. Is that something you're prepared for?
Lots of thoughts on this. You know, the zoo, if we keep up with the analogy, it's full of animals and people who are trained to behave as good boys and good girls. And the expectation in the relationship is that you will behave as a moral person and you will not want to hurt me and you will do everything that you're expected to do. And that's what the trust is based on, is this enforced morality. And when that is taken to an extreme, is we land up in an Orwellian situation, which is like 1984, where everyone has to follow the law and the order, and no one is allowed to step outside of that. Or Brave New World, you know, that's another example where everyone is just in the box behaving perfectly. So you can trust everyone because no one's going to step out of line, either out of fear or out of being medicated into it. And the scary thing about the jungle is that you can't trust when someone may betray you, when someone may abandon you, when someone may reject you, because that's life. Is that people change, people evolve, and you can look at it as rejection and abandonment and betrayal, but people are just following their divine calling. Sometimes people grow out of a relationship. Sometimes people have, like, they just called in a different direction. They just have to abandon what they're doing and they have to go on their own path. And if you take it negatively, you take it as betrayal or abandonment, it's on you. But in the jungle, that's how life is. You know, people will behave in unexpected ways. And as much as you want people to be in the zoo and behave perfectly, that's just not how life works. Like,
Yeah.
even the people who are in the zoo behave sometimes in ways that, you know, they will betray each other, and they will, like, cheating in relationships is just so common, and divorce nowadays is so common, and all of these things just happen, even if you pretend that life is going to be perfect. Finally, life is a junk. It's just a reality. And the in my opinion is that, you know, when you reach the really high levels of consciousness is when you start experiencing something that would be akin to a tribe in a jungle, where you're united by a common purpose. You do care about the welfare of your tribe and the individuals within your tribe, but you're not living in the zoo, so you are also realistic. You know, sometimes things need to be done and actions need to be taken, and not every tribe member can be uh, individually fulfilled to the maximum, because there are certain sacrifices that need to be made. And I feel like that is one of the highest levels of consciousness, when you understand what it is to be a tribe in a jungle. So you understand empathy, you understand compassion, you understand sacrifice, and all of these things for the greater good. You understand what true love is, companionship is. but you're real and you're still living in the jungle, and you're living in the jungle as a tribe versus an individual. And in that, you can find a lot of people and you can find a lot of connection. But it's very challenging because to live at that level, yeah, like you have to really be in alignment. And it's not what we see very commonly. Either we see people who go into who are either they're just living in the first level of the matrix, the zoo, and they're just completely asleep. Then you have the people who wake up from the matrix, but then they basically go into the second level matrix, which is the spiritual morality. Everything is one, everything is love and light, and there should be no evil and there should be no suffering. And then they basically outcast you because you are not behaving according to the spiritual morality. And in my opinion, like it's what I like to call level 69. It's the level beyond the matrix, or the third level of the matrix. It's where you're living in the Holy Trinity, where you're living in the duality. You realize that it's a jungle, and there are certain things that you cannot expect, and it's just how life is.
It's almost like taking the zoo analogy into what you just said. There's the zoo itself. Then there are the grounds of the zoo outside of it, in which you're not in the zoo, but you're still within the overall environment that's heavily influenced by the perceived safety of the zoo. So it's more free than when you're in the zoo, but you're still constrained by some of these other limitations that those that are in the zoo make sure are there in order to protect both their place within the zoo and for them to not have to step too far into the jungle. And then one of the interesting things about the wilderness, particularly in relation to spaces like the zoo, is that the deeper and deeper and deeper you go in, the more and more intense and away from anything that you had related to these strictures can be. So like you said, thinking about the elevation of and the connection with divinity as something that has multiple phases, I can't help but think about the various depths of the jungle within which you step. And for me, at least, stepping beyond and beyond and beyond, perhaps that's what that whole 2.5 year thing was about. Stepping beyond, going deeper and deeper into that heart of the jungle, knowing you may never reach the absolute depth of it because the jungle is so vast and it's so deep, and what's there is layer after layer just never seems to stop. But there is this sense of coolness about it. Not coolness temperature wise, but like you're doing some shit in your life that's really cool. And
You're living. I would say you're living. You're actually living. If you're not going deeper and deeper into the jungle, whether as a tribe or as an individual, you have died. Your soul has died. You've gone into a robotic existence. You're back to the zoo. The zoo keeps expanding, it keeps taking over more and more parts of the jungle. So if you do not keep going along the edge of that zoo and being on the forefront of creativity and expansion and evolution, you do get sucked back into the zoo. So it is kind of like this eternal struggle to not get captured and become a zoo animal.
well, and then that goes as to the discussion about connection and association and building a tribe. If your tribe isn't shifting in its composition and what people are doing, that itself is perhaps a indication that maybe you're letting the zoo start to encroach into you, because inevitably it's just the way human beings are. There are going to always be those that are like, okay, this is as far into the jungle as I want to go, and I'm cool staying here, and the zoo may come and claim me again, but okay, I've gotten to experience this much of the jungle. That's their choice. Of course, it's not for me to judge. But for me, this commitment to staying with my scythe in hand, slashing away and exploring what's further and further within the jungle, is a commitment to my life.
I would say the ultimate the ultimate is to embrace the duality of the zoo and the jungle, where you're living with the comforts of the zoo, but hunting and playing in the jungle. Why lose out on anything? For me, that is the ultimate. It's you are not separating anything in life. You're seeing everything is life. That's why I like to live at the edge of the jungle, where I have the comforts of the zoo, because why not? They're yum. They're absolutely delicious. They make life worth living. But I don't want to get sucked into the zoo and become a caged animal.
It is a very complex thread to navigate if someone is saying, well, how do I do that? I don't even know where to begin. What do you even tell them?
It's a lifestyle. It's something you have to learn to do. Is how to keep your consciousness awake, how to not get sucked into the zoo to the point that you become an animal, and how not to go so deep into the jungle that you just become this ascetic who's like living like a wild animal, like it's because that's what so many people do on the spiritual path. Is like, I'm going to let go and renounce all the modern comforts. Like, you don't have to. If you get it, if you really get it, you don't have to. In Zen Buddhism, they define 10 stages of enlightenment. And the 10th stage is the laughing Buddha, the guy with the big belly who's always laughing. And the way that they explain it is that he's taken the world in. He's no longer living in the world. He's not defined by the world, but he's eating the world. He's consumed the world. He's in the world, but not of it in that sense. And I think that's really it really is the highest level of enlightenment, because that keeping that thread going eternally is the biggest challenge. Because in one moment you can get sick of the zoo and want to go too deep into the jungle, or you can just fall asleep so easily and go back into the zoo. And it's the beauty of it is that it's an eternal struggle. Is that you will never have nailed it. The moment you think you've nailed it, you've fallen asleep in the zoo. It's just how it is. It's what does it mean to be constantly and always alive?
Where is this discussion going to lead us?
So I feel like this has really gone very deep into the 3 core fears that keep us locked in the zoo. And once we start understanding the deeper fears that we have discussed in this show, in this episode, is when we come to the 3 ultimate truths to live by. And we have been discussing them without really naming them. And one of them is impermanence. The second is the impossible. And the third is the unknowable. And I'll very briefly talk about them, because I want people to tune into the next episode where we'll do a much deeper dive into this. There will definitely be so many themes from what we've been discussing, because we've been discussing all these 3. But now naming them makes us understand that these are laws of the universe. So impermanence, change is the only constant. To live by that is what we've been talking about. Like, that is what it means to be fully alive constantly. The moment you settle into a structure that has become rigid, you've gone into the zoo. At the same time, if you have no structure and you're just roaming around in the wild, also it's become a static constant. Then you're not having any change. The change is when you're in the zoo for some time, and then you're in the jungle for some time, and then you're in the zoo and you're in the jungle, or you're just on the edge. Like, that's the wave. It's always going up and down, up and down, up and down. There's no such thing as a static wave. The wave itself is the constant, but the wave also breaks and disappears. So just living by that, it's one of the most fundamental laws. It's one of the ultimate truths. The second is the impossible. What the Buddha said, knowing the absolute is impossible, but I vow to know it. The plan, in my way of looking at it, heaven on earth. Heaven was always meant to be on earth. It was not meant to be something that's afterlife, because there's no such thing as afterlife. In my opinion, heaven was a vision for earth that has started several thousand years ago, and it's a multi-millennia wish to manifest the superconscious, to manifest heaven on earth, which the prophets have been bringing to us literally for thousands of years. They've been talking about heaven, but it's meant to be manifest on earth. But it's impossible. Yet we must never stop trying to make it happen. But as soon as we get to heaven, like as soon as we create heaven on earth, it's going to be destroyed. As soon as we create perfection on earth, it gets destroyed. So we will be exploring this in a much deeper conversation. The next one is the impossibility and why we must still pursue it. And the third is the unknowable. And I think this is, again, the most profound and the scariest and my favorite. The unknowable is literally that which can never be known by anybody. And it's so damn scary to even contemplate that. That it's the thing that even God cannot know. Even the most powerful being, the most omniscient being cannot know the unknowable. We live with this belief that someone knows what's going on. Someone's got this under control. Someone's got reality and life under control.
Right.
How could it be controlled by someone? Right? Like even if this is simulation, there's something outside the simulation. Like even atheists at some level believe that even if the belief is random, how did this randomness happen? Something must have, right? Like you to believe that no one is controlled, but at some very deep survival level, we need to believe that someone is in control. Someone knows everything that's going on. And I like to come and like to confront the unknowable. It kills something in you. It is a truth that collapses your ego in a way that nothing else does. And so we will dive very deep into that too in the next one.
Thinking about the concept of the unknowable not being known by anything that exists or ever has existed or ever will exist is, to me, even thinking about it, unbelievably existentially frightening. But it also represents, if nothing else, an existentially exciting area of discussion.
It's the core mystery of life. Like to understand that the mystery can never be solved. The moment you solve it, it changes its form. It's so beautiful. It's so exciting.
And so worth exploring. I can't wait. For those of you who enjoyed this episode, be sure to find out more about Tio and me in the captions below. And make sure to leave comments as well as subscribe so that you can get notice about these videos when they come out in the future. Also, be sure to check out the prior videos. At the very end of this recording, you'll see a little bumper that can connect you to the first one if you haven't had a chance to look at it so far. Tio, this has been amazing. For me, it's been a trip that is beyond epic. How has it been for you?
I loved it too. And I'm so excited once again. Like, this, it's not like I or we plan these in advance.
We don't.
Several times the topic comes just before, few days before. And it's just an exploration that's so exciting, like life. And, the topic of the ultimate truths also literally just dropped an hour before this episode was recorded. So I'm so excited to dive into that. And yeah, this is one of my ultimate joys, having these discussions and these contemplations. And not just discussing them, but living by them. And that's what we're going to be discussing as we keep going deeper, is how do we actually live on the edge of the jungle in the zoo.
Here's to breaking out, my brother. I want your future to be epic.